Hello and welcome to Choose a Fi. Today on the show, we have Barbara Sloan. She is the author of Tipped, the life-changing guide to financial freedom for waitresses, bartenders, strippers, and all other service industry professionals. And she's also the creator of tipfinance.com. She was actually a main stage speaker at the Economy Conference, which I just came back from about a month ago. And she gave one of the best speeches I've ever heard in my entire life. And in listening to that speech, I realized just how significant of a whole this concept is in our standard FI advice. We don't speak to service industry professionals. We simply don't. And that's inexcusable. Barbara spent 20 years working for Tips in the service industry, and for the past 3 years has built Tip Finance, which is a financial education company aimed to serve service industry professionals or tipped workers. I think this is going to be a phenomenal episode. With that, welcome to Choose a FI. Barbara, welcome to Choose a Fi. I'm so happy to have you here.
Brad, I am so excited to be here. Thanks for chatting with me.
Yeah, this should be fun. So we became fast friends at Economy, and it's good to see your face. I'm really excited about this. It should be fun. So let's start from the very beginning. Like I said, this is a huge hole we've had 600 plus episodes of Choose a Fi. We have never spoken to service industry professionals. Let's start just very simply. What are the categories of these SIPs? We'll shorten it, right, as you do in your book. What are the categories? Because I'm stumbling over it every single time I say it. So
yeah, SIP stands for Service Industry Professional. I shortened it in the book just because I could not continue to write it over and over again. I was like, this is going to drive me nuts.
Hard to write, hard to say. So, okay, how many people are we talking about roughly? And what are the main categories, just so people can have a conceptual framework for what we're talking about?
Yeah, so service industry professionals, I always love to talk to personal finance people about this because it's the same thing with a brokerage account, right? Like everyone's like, a brokerage account is any account at a brokerage firm. But when we talk about a brokerage account, we're talking all about an after-tax account. The same thing is true for service industry. Everybody does service. But when we are talking about the service industry, we're talking about a very specific group of employment types. And so I break it into 3 categories. The first is bars, restaurants, clubs, the hospitality side, right? So those are people who are going to be waitresses, your bartenders. The next is beauty and body services. So think massage therapists, tattoo artists. The last category is kind of transportation, delivery sort of side. And so that's going to be your delivery drivers, your Ubers, your taxis, your movers, people who are going to be delivering you things.
Interesting. Okay. Now, obviously, there are these 3 major categories. Are there any, I guess, ties that bind or massive differences just amongst those 3 categories before we even get started going down the road here?
Yeah, and this is a great question. So my focus for people who work in the service industry is on that first category, the people who work in bars, clubs, and restaurants. And I focus mainly on them because they are held to an entirely different sub-minimum wage, which is federally $2.13. These are the most vulnerable of people in the service industry. Whereas people who work in beauty and body services sometimes have different payment contracts and styles. People who work for Uber or drive for DoorDash, they're part of the regular federal minimum wage.
Gotcha. Okay, so $2.13, I mean, rounds down to 0 in essence. Like, it's crazy town. How is that possible in this day and age?
Yeah, and I think, most people don't think about the fact that there is this sub-minimum wage. So when everyone's talking about the minimum wage, we're having conversations about minimum wage. Lobbyists, people in the government are talking about changing minimum wage. And that's what gets the focus and the attention. So the minimum wage has changed over the years, whereas the sub-minimum wage, which gets no attention, it has not changed since like the 60s. And so, yeah, these people are really left behind. The fact that we're still talking about $2.13, which is like $1.60 less than a gallon of milk, is just, it's atrocious.
Yeah, that's crazy. So for this first category, again, bars, restaurants, hospitality, that's what we're going to talk about mostly here. So $2.13 an hour. So that means the vast majority, just by definition, of their compensation comes from tips. But yeah, it is the most unreliable, like just from how I'm looking at it, is like that could mean a couple $100 on a Friday night, or who knows, a Bass Slow Friday night, $100, or a Tuesday night or something like that. Like, how on earth with that variability of income Where do you even start with personal finance when you have no sense of what you're going to earn in a given week, month, or whatever?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest. Oh, yeah, but Barbara, I can't budget because I work on a fluctuating income that I hear when I'm talking to service industry professionals about managing their money and getting better with their money. It's difficult. And I think you have to acknowledge that it's going to be harder for you, especially when we're talking to people who are low and middle income, which many people in this industry are low or middle income. But the fact is that you go into this industry knowing that there's this risk versus reward. And a lot of people who are in this industry, they like that there's no upside. They like that they can use their skills to earn that tip, to get a bigger portion of their compensation. There's no cap to what they can earn. And honestly, this is one of the industries where a lot of people can move socioeconomic classes because this is the one industry where you can work more to make more. There's not a lot of other industries where you can do that. And so there's a lot of potential in this industry, but it's also mostly around luxury services. So you're not going to find tipping in places where there's a basic human need. You don't find tipping at the grocery store. You don't find tipping at your physical therapy or doctor's office. You're not going to find tipping in places where there's need, but you are going to find it around all luxury services. You don't need to go to a restaurant. If you need food, you go to the grocery store. You have a potluck, you have a picnic. You don't need to take a taxi. You have your own car, you bike, you walk, you take other modes of transportation, the bus, right? So it's often you find tipping in conjunction with luxury services. And as a community, people who are growing their wealth, we're getting a whole new set of people entering the market of engaging with luxury services, and you have to educate those people. Every industry that you enter, you have to be an engaged and informed consumer. And that includes people who are entering into engaging with luxury services. So I hear all of the time that people don't understand how to tip or why tipping exists or why this industry is so different. And they just need an education on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is such an interesting thing. And like you said, the risk versus reward. There's that skill to earn a tip. And that's cool on the upside of, hey, maybe you're giving outstanding service, right? And you get, instead of a paltry 15 or 18% tip, you're getting 25, 35, who knows what it is, right?
Oh, yeah.
And like that, that is really cool to have that. But on the one hand, you're saying, or I'm saying from afar, like, what the heck kind of, this is the oddity of this, in that this 213 sub minimum wage, are the employers, like, are they actually employing these? Like, the vast majority of their pay is not coming from their technical employer.
Yeah.
It's coming from, like, what a weird system. Is there anything you've gleaned from like the genesis of that would be particularly interesting, I guess, to pass along?
Yeah. I think what's interesting is that people automatically vilify the owners of these establishments. And now I'm here supporting the workers of this. Like, that's my game, right? I was in the industry for 20 years and I wrote this book. I started this business to help people who are working in this industry. But the employers are not terrible people because they don't provide a higher wage and benefits. This has been around for over 150 years. This wage and compensation style. And the reason behind it is because service is a subjective experience. You're the only person that can gauge how your experience went. And so the worker, the employer, and the government all have this agreement of like, hey, we're going to let you subsidize this so that we don't have to pay higher wages, payroll taxes, employer benefits, hire an HR person, manage compliance, all of the things that go into that, because we understand and recognize the fact that 90% of these businesses are owned by small mom and pop shops. We understand that there's a ton of intangible benefits that this industry provides to the communities and the economy. And so we allow this, and it works in this particular way.
Yeah, but that whole list of things you just rattled off there, right? HR, retirement, healthcare, like, these are all the things that normal, quote unquote normal, and I use that very loosely and sarcastically, 9-to-5 workers have and just take for granted. And you're saying, obviously, the SIPs here are not getting that as just part of their normal structure of working for this mom and pop restaurant, but they still need those things, right? Like, they still need a retirement plan. They still need health insurance. What do you do?
Absolutely. And like, these industries also just came off of COVID. So many of them went under. So many, like, there's not a way that they can turn this around in a fast enough time to make an impact for these workers. And that's a big part of the reason that I wanted to write the book, is because, like, I also work in construction, and one of the industries that I work in, there's an organization called OSHA, and OSHA trained the workforce and changed the industry from within. And that's really what I want to do, is like teach people how they can take control of their finances themselves, because I don't have the ability or the language or the resources to make changes at a federal, state, or corporate level. We can only control what we can control. And so I want to be able to give people at least language to be able to advocate for themselves for those benefits, and ways that they can kind of mirror these traditional employer benefits, because you are so right. It is beyond important. Service industry professionals age into the most economically disadvantaged people in our population. We have got to do something.
Yeah, indeed. And that's actually something I wanted to talk about later, certainly was, as you're saying, aging into. I mean, many of these jobs are extraordinarily physically taxing. Is there a lifespan to a career that is more akin to, I'm almost thinking in terms of like a professional athlete who, hey, by the time 35, 40 rolls around, you can't do this anymore. I think about like a massage therapists who are literally using their hands for, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 hours a day. How long can you do that? And then, okay, even if you made decent money, what next? And that's why your education is so critical.
But we find that in a lot of low and middle income type industries, right? You working at an auto body place is really hard on your body, and other industries have similar impacts, maybe not physically, but mentally, right? I worked in financial services for a while. That takes a huge toll on your mental health.
Yes,
you know, I'm not sure you come out of a 40-year career unscathed, but totally. Yeah, every industry has its hazards. And that's one of the hazards of this industry, is that it takes a toll on your body. And so, yeah, you have to be able to think long term. And that's one of the hazards of this industry, is that you get quick access to cash and you think short term and you think, oh, I'll worry about this when I get a quote unquote real job. Because a big part of the problem in this industry and with these careers is that we don't think of them as legitimate careers. And so when you don't think of it as legitimate careers, then you don't act accordingly with your money. You don't treat it as real money. You don't protect it. You aren't a good steward over it. And so a big part of my messaging is the first piece of things that we do for people in the service industry is let's track our money, because this is one of those industries where you're not getting a W-2 at the end of the year telling you how much you made in tips. You have to track it yourself. And until you start tracking it, you don't realize the power that your income has. And especially when you have that realization of like, oh, I made 60 grand and I have nothing to show for it. That means I spent 60 grand. That's a huge moment for people who have not been tracking their income and have really no idea how much they make.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, there's so many parallels, obviously, to financial independence and the messaging of Choose FI. What we very precisely talked about, like just to kind of parrot back some of the things, the important things you said, think long term, the stoic thought of control what you can control, right? Okay, nobody's coming to save you in essence. You have to take control yourself. And you're talking about changing this from within, in essence, by education and leading by example. I mean, this is literally exactly what we're talking about here. And you said we don't think of them as, quote, real careers. And it's interesting because I think when you use that we, you actually meant even the people in these jobs, which seems crazy to me. But yeah, like a lot of it seems to be, and I know my brother was a waiter for many years, and there's this YOLO mentality of, hey, we've worked so hard, we're all going to go out after and, go to the bar and spend all our money. And like, it seems really fun. I mean, from afar, like it seems pretty fun, like as a younger person in your 20s, maybe 30s, whatever. But yet, as you're saying, you could make $60,000 and have nothing to show for it, which is, as we know, is crazy, especially when there is nobody coming to save you with retirement benefits and healthcare and all these things. So like, you really need to take this. And I love how you said you have to start with tracking. That is day one. So how do you very practically tell people, like, what do you use? Are there tools? How would they get started? Somebody who's never tracked before.
Yeah. I mean, it's really as broad as recommending a budgeting app or a budgeting method, right? Like for some people, the note section in their phone is going to be the best thing. For some people, it's going to be a Google Sheet or an Excel doc. For some people, those apps, there are specifically tip tracking apps that you can search on your phone that you can install. There are budgeting apps where you can implement your income manually, for instance. And so those are just some of the strategies for tracking your income, but find something that works. And if you don't find consistency with one thing, you have to keep iterating. One of the things I always like to say to people who work in the service industry is, especially when they push back on like, oh, well, I never know how much I'm going to make. And I'm like, right, but neither does any business at all, ever. And so you have to do what a business does. And I'm lucky enough to be married to somebody who does corporate finance for, a publicly traded Fortune 500 company. And I talk to her and we nerd out about all of this stuff all of the time. And when I boil down what she does, in essence, it is look for trends, make targets, and look back and see how you fared against those targets. That's how you manage your money on a fluctuating income. And it's really that simple. And it's really also very hard because it's painful to go back and iterate.
Yeah.
You want this even, very planned out roadmap. And it's like, no, your specific situation is just like any very specific and unique company. You have to be engaged. You have to be a part of it. And you have to look for those trends. And people will often say, oh, there are no trends. It's always just so fluctuating. But that's not true. When you analyze it, there's always trends. If you're working at a club, for instance, your summers are going to be slow. Your sporting events are going to be slow. If you work in a restaurant that has a patio, your summers are going to be really busy. We all know that times around the holidays are a little bit more flush with cash. And so there's always seasonality in this work. And you can always tailor when you're going to try to save for things or when you're going to try to build in your buffers around some of those seasons of excess. And so that looking for trends part's really important.
Yeah, that's so critical. And yeah, it's amazing in going through your book, the similarities between SIPs and entrepreneurs, just generally. Like it's almost a one-to-one thing in essence of, like you're saying, trends. You need to do that. You have to have some sense of, hey, what was last January like? What was the prior January like? And I think in conjunction with financial independence principles, which is also critical, right? Like having an emergency fund, not living on the edge, even in your business account. Because if you're doing that and you realize, oh, every January, every February, what pick a month is a especially slow one, and you don't have that buffer, well, you're going to have a real problem. Just like you're saying, okay, in clubs, the summer is slower.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you need to understand that you're going to have bumps in income during certain months or certain times of the year, and that needs to tide you over. I think about like towns that have real high vacation spots. Like, we always go up to Algonquin in Maine or the Outer Banks in North Carolina. And like, obviously, those businesses are getting the vast majority of their income in June, July, and August. And in essence, they still have to pay rent. They still have to cover their expenses the other 9 months a year. But that significant amount of income needs to tide them over for all of that time. And the reason why I bring that up is you talk about, okay, maybe focusing on your expenses might be the better way to approach your personal finances when you are in these service industries.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that we hear oftentimes in personal finance advice is to budget based off of your income. But for people who are in businesses and people who are in these fluctuating income situations, even consultants, your expenses are going to be more fixed. It's going to be more easy for you to budget based off your expenses than it is based off of your income. And, what you were talking about with like those little towns that have just really big summers, what I often like to tell people is like pair that with something else, right? Like my strategy when I worked in clubs was to find another job that was really busy during the summer. And honestly, that was such a resource to management to be like, oh, I don't have to support all of these people during a slow summer month. I can know that, this person is going to go and look for a summer job or get a summer patio job or a bar job that's going to be busier for them. I can take them off the schedule. I can load up for the other people who need the shifts and they'll come back when it's busy. And so when you recognize those trends, you can start to use your management as a resource. You can you can reverse engineer into a career path or maybe multiple jobs that really serve your life.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So, right, you actually become more valuable in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
And if your employer in that case knows you're coming back, there's no issue. It's not like they need to string you along and, give you a shift or two a week just so you continue employment. This is mutually beneficial because, right, again, you're looking at trends and you're understanding, okay, I need to maximize for myself here as well. So yeah, that's really, really cool. I like that. So Barbara, we're obviously talking about tips. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of your book that sounds counterintuitive, I think, on the face of it, or at least based on what we've heard of people in service industries, is okay, you're getting these tips, which are not being written down anywhere. And I think people have a tendency to underreport them when it comes to tax time. Now, I'm a CPA. You obviously go on record saying, like, this is clearly illegal. You should not be doing this. We're not advocating this. But the practical reality is that's what people do, or at least that's what you hear as in terms of, okay, this is going to advantage you on some level. That is anybody really going to be able to track this? But putting that aside, because it is somewhat illegal, you advocate clearly, okay, there's actually something interesting here that we all may have overlooked. And really the play is to claim all of these tips. Could you just give a real high level overview of this?
Yeah, I think for people who aren't in the industry, there's almost this assumption of this nefarious activity of like, oh, I'm going to like get one over on the government by not claiming all of my income, when really think about it in terms of how you would interact with something if you had to claim all of your expenses. Because that's really what the comparison is. If you're not tracking all of your expenses or if you had to report all of your expenses to the government, you would probably have a hard time with that too. And it's the same for people in the service industry. It's not necessarily a nefarious activity. It's usually just like it's a hassle to write down what you're making every single day. You don't think about it. It flows. You have ins and outs like, oh, I didn't tip out my busboy or my barback or my bouncer yesterday, so I have to tip them out tomorrow. There's just like constant ins and outs of it as well. And so it's often an overlooked aspect of this industry, the importance of claiming tips. And the thing is that there are a lot of benefits that are based on your income. And so some of them are unemployment, the lending rates that you receive for your credit cards, your mortgages, things like, products from financial services. But the biggest is a huge financial safety net that we have in the US, and that's Social Security. So Social Security was designed to be a partial income replacement plan. And when it was created, it was designed to protect people who fell between the gaps of 401ks and pensions. So it was created kind of around that same time. But what's interesting is that the only people who still fall through the cracks of Social Security are service industry professionals. And it's because they're not claiming their income in full. And so the really terrifying numbers is that the majority of currently retired service industry professionals rely solely on Social Security for their income. And when you realize that in 2020, I think the average Social Security payout was less than $20,000, and that's for people who claim their income in full, we're talking about some really scary numbers that people are going to have to rely on. And so, when I mentioned this earlier, that SIPs age into the most economically disadvantaged people in our population. This is one of the biggest reasons, is because they fall through the safety net and they don't realize that some of their short-term thinking, or maybe not thinking at all, of not claiming all of their tips, is going to have a really big impact on them later in life.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, right. Again, it's short-term versus long-term. Mm-hmm. Okay, short-term, I might be saving a couple bucks in taxes, which frankly, if people are at a lower marginal tax bracket anyway, if they're not making all that much money in the cosmic scheme of things, it's the epitome of penny wise, pound foolish, right? Like maybe you're saving 10, 12 cents on the dollar by, again, pulling a fast one, as you're saying, on the government, but you're foregoing all of these legitimate benefits that you would get if you reported your income in full. So that is short versus long. And also, I'm curious, I guess, about like the intersection of, entrepreneurs. So that's how I look again. Like I'm now an entrepreneur, which is crazy. I've, CPA for most of my career, and now I'm an entrepreneur. I think about just how difficult the taxation system is for people who even know what they're doing, right? And you talk about nobody's coming to save you with withholding, especially if you're making $2.13 an hour, even if you were having all of your wages withheld for federal and state taxes. That's a pittance. So I imagine there are many people in the service industry who file their tax return maybe that first year and, oh my goodness, I owe a boatload at return time. I mean, hopefully that's the wake-up call, but talk me through like that first year, because I'm sure you've seen that in many of your friends and colleagues who have that aha moment. And then What do you do from there in terms of paying in taxes? Like, how do you advise people on that?
I mean, I can just speak from my own experiences over the years. And like, I will remember, I was scared of the government. There was no way I was like intentionally trying to cheat anyone out of money. And so like for me, I would roll into like H&R Block and I'd be like, I don't know, how much do you think I made? Like, this is kind of what I made each shift. And this is kind of how many shifts I worked over the course of, each week. And that was sort of how we got there. And then when I owed, I was like, oh, okay, is there any way we can adjust that? I wasn't getting good tax planning. I was getting people who were certified to file taxes, and that was great and helpful and good. But it's really different when you get a tax planning professional who understands that these positions are by and large people who are their own employers, and that there are strategies that can help reduce that tax liability for them throughout the year. But yeah, there's some years where I had to set up payment plans, and that was super painful. There were years where I didn't file because I was like, oh, I'm going to owe. And then it was a 2 years or 3 years later down the road where I had to like figure all of that out. And it was super, super painful and scary. And so I think a big part of this is educating people in that, you may want to put some money aside if you think you're going to owe some taxes. There's some ways that we can offset this. One of them is a great tool, right? We can do an IRA, and that can reduce your tax liability. If you're considered an employer, like I get a lot of people who work in this industry who are like, oh, my employer's trying to screw me over by keeping me off the books and, giving me a 1099 or keeping me a cash worker. And I'm like, great. That's awesome for you. You don't need that $2.13. Be a business. Let them screw you the whole way over, because if you're an employer for yourself, you have access to a whole lot more accounts. You can set up a solo 401k. You can set up a SEP IRA. If you're an employer for yourself, you can write off your cell phone bill, your health insurance, your uniforms. There's so many options if you are a business, a legit business as a service industry professional.
Ooh, okay. We've hit on something here. So is there an option for people then in lieu of that 213? Like instead of paying it via, hey, I'm a W-2, do you have the option to say, oh, what about making me a 1099 employee? Have you ever seen that?
I mean, you and I are not allowed to give tax, legal, or financial advice.
Clearly, right.
Clearly.
I'm a CPA, but I just play one on the podcast here. So clearly this is not to anybody. We're just talking here.
But yeah, I mean, especially if you are one of those people who are going to work multiple jobs, and sometimes maybe you do like a side catering gig, whatever the case is, there's a case to be made that you are your own employer if you're managing all of these gigs and you're managing all of these things. And there's a strategy in there that is going to be very beneficial for you for sure. And it's not in just being a W-2 employee.
Yeah, I like that. And as you're saying, clearly we're talking about legitimate business expenses, but there is a broad swath of what those include. In your case, you're saying, hey, there's a reasonable likelihood that a portion of your cell phone bill or more than a portion could be construed as a legitimate business expense. But again, this is not tax advice. We're just kind of talking here, but we all know small business owners. And even if you don't have an entity set up, that's fine. You can still report this on your Schedule C, on your 1040.
Yeah, you're a sole prop.
Yeah, you have your income coming in, your expenses going out. And one thing I really wanted to dial in just quickly is you're not having your taxes withheld. And I think one of the things I've realized as a business owner is you need to send in estimated payments every quarter to the federal government. And I think this is something that a lot of people overlook because, I mean, if you literally, even if you have a small liability, quote unquote, small liability of $1,000, $2,000 on your return, and you've paid in zero, well, come April 15th, you have to pay all of that money. And how many people have that lying around? That's what I was talking about before of like that nightmare scenario.
Yeah. And I think that happens for a lot of people because they aren't tracking their income. So there is not that strategy in place. And so you'll go in and you'll say, oh, I'm going to claim 40 grand. Oh no, I can't afford that. How about I claim 30 grand? How about I claim, you know what I mean? And that's when it gets into, sort of that short-term thinking where you think I'm going to save on taxes, but you're going to hurt yourself long-term in terms of Social Security, unemployment, not getting good rates from your lenders. If you are going to, the two biggest ways that Americans build wealth, the first is through their 401k, and the second is through their primary residence. And both of those are kind of off the table for SIPs unless they get creative. The first is that their employers are not providing them with a 401k, a 457, a 453b. And so a lot of people in this industry don't think that they can set up a retirement account because we associate retirement accounts as being a benefit that's provided by your employer, because that's how we talk about it a lot in the personal finance space. Get the match from your employer. We hear that all the time. And so that association of it being something that has to go with your employer is almost embedded. And so for me, a big part is like reminding people, no, first of all, the only reason these accounts are called retirement accounts is because they have preferential tax treatment. Anything can be used as a retirement account. Your sock drawer can be used as a retirement account if you build it, right? So it's really just a vessel. And in that, you can use a brokerage account if that's your only option, an IRA and a brokerage account. That is still a great option for a retirement account. Is it the most tax advantage? No, it's not. And we can be honest about that, but it's still a great option. It still means that you can retire, and it still means that you could retire early.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, like you're saying, there are potentially these quote unquote retirement, even if we wanted to go down that road, there are these accounts that you may have access to. Certainly, if you are a sole proprietor, you should have access to different options such as the solo 401k, the SEP IRA. Obviously, again, we're not giving advice here, but you should look into these things. You might have the option to contribute to a traditional IRA, which is pre-tax, or potentially a Roth IRA, whatever you decide, of course, but you're not shut out from these things. That's really important. And just one last thing, because this is my kind of geeky CPA thing, a actionable tip that we've passed along here a couple of times on Choosify that people just seem to love is when it comes to your tax return, and let's say you are underpaid and you made a good faith effort or you just didn't realize, and okay, you obviously owe your tax liability, no question about it. If there's interest that has accrued on it, you're going to have to pay that. But if the IRS ever sends you a letter or notice that has a penalty on it, my strong advice would be to reply with what's known as like a request for abatement. And that's just a big fancy word for, please get rid of this stupid thing. So in essence, you're just sending in a nice short little letter saying, I request an abatement of the penalty, and I was wholly unaware of, you come up with just some flowery language of, I didn't realize this. Now I completely understand. I promise this will never happen again. I've taken care to send in estimated payments and blah, blah, blah. But, something very short and sweet. I have seen anecdotally, of course, a 90+% success rate with these penalty abatement letters. So again, at the time, you also send in, say, of course, I understand that I owe this tax and this interest that was also on that notice. Here's the check. You find it attached. That'll up the likelihood, probably, again, anecdotally, to 99% likelihood of that penalty being abated. So just a cool little tip I wanted to pass along.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I have one more, and then we can move on from taxes, because I'm sure you and I'm a tax nerd too. Like, I'm sure we could geek out all the time on this. Let's say you are a full-time W-2 worker, your restaurant, your club, it has you on a W-2, and they are doing forced tip claiming where they're going to claim all of your tips for you. One of my favorite strategies when you do have a tax preparer is to have them write a letter of the amount of money that you pay out in tip outs to deduct that from your income. So if you're tipping out every night to your barback and your bouncer and your busboy and any of the people that you're tipping out to, that's a deduction. And so you add up all of those tip outs and give that to your tax preparer and say, we need to reduce my income by this amount.
Yes, that is so brilliant, because I'm sure a lot of people just get that, whatever the form is, W-2, 1099, whatever it may be, and just plop it on. But yet they didn't receive all of that. So those were their gross tips, but their net tips after, like you said, that is a standard practice, that tipping out. And if you have to immediately turn around and pay that as an expense as part of your business, in essence, that is a legitimate business expense. So clearly, that has to be netted out on your tax return. So I'm super glad you mentioned that. I wanted to ask about, so we're talking about things that people in the service industry might miss out on, but what are potential strategies? So now obviously we've talked about a little bit about retirement, a little bit about taxes. Now health insurance is a massive one. So most people, or a significant number of people, get their health insurance through their traditional employer.
Yep.
And I'll tell you, as being an entrepreneur, most people have no idea just how expensive it can be, especially when you don't get ACA subsidies or things. I mean, it's extraordinary. We pay about $15,000 a year just in premiums to essentially get nothing. It's just like burned in a fireplace, more or less. But many people who have those 9 to 5s, they're paying a fraction of that because the rest of it is picked up by their employer. That's part of their salary, whether they realize it or not. And now, obviously, many people in the service industry, the vast majority, from what I've heard, in your book and prior interviews, almost nobody, I think you said sub 5%, it's probably significantly less than 5%, have health insurance plans at work, right?
Yeah, it's a really small percentage. It's like 5%.
Okay. So, right. So then you have to do something. And with the advent of the ACA, there are at least options. I'm curious about like the intersection of the ACA and subsidies for potentially people who are not making all that much in the cosmic scheme of things, or even like you said, 60, 80. I mean, there are potential to get subsidies. So I wonder if is it an education issue, like as the almost overriding issue?
Yeah. And I'd say if you're somebody who's been in the industry for a long time, and maybe you were in the industry before the ACA came about, it's really important for you to go on, and they have calculators for you to be able to kind of plug in your income and figure out what subsidies you can earn. Because oftentimes, like I do one-on-one coaching for people in the industry, and oftentimes when we go on and we look at those things, it's only like 70 or 80 bucks a month for them. And it's really affordable and reasonable based on where they're living, what their income levels are, and their specific situation. And so I'm so glad that the marketplace exists, because it's been a huge resource for a lot of people. But let's say, for instance, you are earning a lot of money in this industry. Maybe you're in the club environment and you have a really high income and you're not eligible for those subsidies. Maybe the marketplace is not a great place for you. What's cool about the marketplace is that, they're not denying anything based on your pre-existing conditions, right? Like everything on the marketplace is held to a specific standard because that's the employer market, but there's also health shares. And health shares can be an option for people to get. And obviously there's the warning of do your own homework here, because you could have some sort of health thing that's excluded from those policies. But those can be a really affordable option if, for instance, you are somebody who couldn't afford a plan on the marketplace. And so some insurance is always better than no insurance. And if you're at the point where in your financial strategy, you're layering in some of these new protection measures like an insurance policy, if the marketplace is not an option for you, I encourage people to look into some of those health share programs.
Yeah, I think it's worth looking into. I know I have some personal experience with health share from years ago, and I did have a positive experience with them, but it's not insurance.
It's not.
So at the end of the day, right, there's no legal guarantee that if you get hit by a bus or have cancer, or that it's going to be paid out regardless of whether you have it or not. So I think I love your thought process there. And I totally agree that some is better than none. So especially, right, if it's like extraordinarily inexpensive, there are many of these health shares have some religious aspects to them as well. So that's not going to work for a lot of people. But as always, it's worth doing your research. It is always worth doing your research. And yeah, I think those ACA subsidies, going back to that, like that can be for many people who don't make an extraordinary income, and whatever the definition of that is, it's worth looking into.
Yeah.
I think like we hear all these horror stories of like Obamacare and all this other nonsense. And like it has done a great good for many, many, many millions of people. This is an extraordinary thing that exists, and you're doing yourself a disservice by not looking into it.
And the health insurance portion is really important, especially when we're looking at subsidies. This is why tax planning is so important, because let's say that you make $60,000 and you are now ineligible for those subsidies. What if you made $58,000? Right? Like what if that writing that letter about your tip claiming, or, deducting some of those expenses if you were set up as a business, pushed you below that threshold where you'd be eligible for those subsidies. One of my favorite things about this industry is that you can back into an income number. You can work as much as you'd like to back into it. This is also one of the reasons that I'm super passionate about talking to FI people about this industry, because I think there's so many advantages to that. That's a conversation for another day. But I do love that you can—
Part two.
I love that you can back into your income number for things like subsidies.
Yeah, that's cool. And talking about income is one of the most interesting aspects of the service industry. Is people seem actually very open, more so than in just about any other industry, of actually talking about what they earn. Like, oh, I earned X amount on that Friday night. And it seems like there's actually some potential here where, okay, this is one of the few industries where people are okay talking about money, which is the last great taboo in America, which is so silly. But yet there's this lack of, I guess, planning, of education, and of like, what are we doing this for? Like you're saying, you're going to wake up 10 or 15 years from now And yeah, you might have made 60 grand every year, but if you don't have anything to show for it, what was it all for? So
Yeah.
I know that's not exactly a question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think it's really easy to get into this industry and think that you're only going to be here for a few years. But if you are somebody who has the skill sets, or you believe that some of this is a craft that you enjoy, right? Like you enjoy entertaining, you enjoy bringing up the energy of establishment, you're great at these points of service, you're good at upselling, you're good at time management, you can really get in a flow state in this industry, and it's really enjoyable. I belong to a couple fire meetup groups, and it's really interesting. We'll get into like talking about sequence of return risk and things like that. And people will be like, oh, if there's a downturn in the market, I'll just go back to work the first 5 years. And I'm like, okay, well, what will you do? And the number one answer I hear is, I'll go back to like bartending or being a barista or waiting tables. And I'll say, why? And they'll say, that was my favorite job ever. And I'm like, for the people who are in this industry, why are we working in it for 5-10 years, leaving it to go for something better, and then going back into it? Like, why not put the systems in place initially and have an amazing long-term career doing what we love, but maybe not doing it in such an extreme way? I love this idea of this industry with lifestyle design. And I think it's a really enjoyable career that if you put the proper systems and boundaries in place, you can create a life of your dreams. And so that's part of why I'm so passionate about showing people these systems and how you can recreate these employer provided benefits, because I think for the people who are gifted in these skill sets of entertaining and energy and being a smile to the people in their community, I think it's so important and beautiful. So those are some of my initial thoughts to that.
Wow. Yeah, Barbara, that is so beautifully put. I think there's just so much here. It's astonishing.
Yeah. And like what's interesting about that beautiful lifestyle design is that really what we're working with is getting people who have a short-term abundance mindset and a long-term scarcity mindset to kind of learn from that short-term abundance mindset and to kind of create it into that long-term abundance mindset and have that long-term thinking in place. Because what you just said initially when you were talking about the fact that that income transparency is there, like we already do back of the envelope math. We're already really comfortable with a lot of this stuff. It's just we need a little more information and a little more guidance to be able to break out of that scarcity mindset and to transition some of these skills into, a long-term strategy. We were talking earlier about the two ways that Americans build wealth, one with their, 401k and the other with their primary residence. The reason that people are able to build wealth through their 401k is because of automation, because they have Sharon in HR who has them check a box on a form. And we give all of our 9-to-5ers this credit of having this long-term strategy, but really it's because it was taken out of their hands. Behaviorally, it's not on the table. It's that automation piece provided a long-term strategy for them. And what's missing is our ability to kind of create that automation for the people in this industry to develop that long-term thinking.
Yeah, it's critical. And I love how you brought that to a minute or two ago about people in the FI community. Like this could really fit in beautifully for so many of us in the FI community, and especially who have that long-term thinking as just kind of embedded in our mindset as it is. And just as you're going through that, you're talking about, so right, obviously these two main ways that people build wealth is, okay, buying homes. I know how hard it is as an entrepreneur without a W-2 income to qualify for a mortgage. I'm curious, like, how does this work for people in the service industry in terms of, is it based on your W-2? Is it based on your self-reported tips? Is it based on, okay, as we're talking about, many of these might be self-employed. Like, and I know, and this is a very long way of saying, like, it's really hard without multiple years of, hey, this is what I made this year and that year. And it's showing it on paper from prior tax returns. Like, do people in the service industry, I guess most succinctly, do they have real issues qualifying for mortgages in general or other financial loans and things like that, cars, et cetera? Like, is this a problem that you've encountered?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had it myself. I have had no credit, terrible credit, in addition to not claiming my income in full and not being able to show income, which is a big part of the underwriting process for traditional lending, which is how most people get into real estate. it becomes almost impossible for people to get into the real estate game in this industry. And so that's why the conversation always has to start with tracking your income and understanding the value of what you're making and the importance of claiming it so that you do have access to that avenue of real estate, because it's a real way to build wealth for a lot of people.
Yeah. So yet another compelling reason why you need to be part of the financial system, right? You need to claim all of these tips. There's just layer upon layer upon layer of this. And if you don't, again, for that short term, oh, hey, I might get 10 or 12 cents on the dollar by doing this illegally, as we both know, like it just so vastly overrides it to get these long-term benefits. And really even these short-term benefits of just being part of the financial system.
Yeah. And I think if you're also an industry professional, you have access to control your income in that you can work more when you need to. And I love the idea of real estate investing for people in this industry because one, you're working these strange hours and so many other people who also work strange hours. So like house hacking is such a great way for people in this industry to build wealth because you often have times where you're exposed and around of a lot of people who have the ability to work more to make more, that also likely will not be able to qualify for maybe an apartment because a lot of times you have to show your income for certain apartment complexes or for their own. So you're around all of these people who have money, but maybe not ways to get housing. And so to be a resource for that, but also to be able to like make money off of it, I think it's such a great thought exercise and avenue for people to explore in this industry.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. That concept of house hacking, that's like the one that got away from me in terms of like, man, I wish when I was 22 or 25 that I had some sense of that. It just would have been cool. So yeah, this is really a perfect industry, especially maybe if people, and this might be a broad brush, tend to be on the younger side, or certainly I think of people in their 20s and 30s, again, broad brush. And that's, it's probably some inaccuracy there, or people with different schedules, or, hey, you're used to living with roommates. Like that is the perfect way to do house hacking. You never know, just how beneficial that can be.
And there's no excuse for them not to pay rent because they can just go pick up a few more shifts, right?
Yeah, I love that flexibility. That's such a cool aspect of the service industry generally. It's like, hey, yeah, I can pick up another shift and or you never know, find another job.
And it's also one of those industries where it's really easy to get another job pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Like there's always people hiring. You can always transition. One of the other things I like to talk about is the importance of an emergency fund in this industry because there is that power imbalance of you are serving somebody else. And so you can't be reliant on their specific tip if you want to keep yourself safe, if you want to hold yourself to certain values and boundaries. And so you need that emergency fund in place to protect yourself and to show up as yourself fully in this career path. And so oftentimes I get a lot of pushback from people in this industry. I remember the first time I had heard about an emergency fund, I was like, I'm sorry, you want me to stick how much money in an account? Not for a vacation, not for a house, not for any purpose, just sitting there doing nothing. And that was a really hard concept for me personally to get on board with. And so it's hard for this industry to recognize that too. But it's one of my favorite financial products because it really does protect you. And I think a lot of ways that you can pivot within this industry involve taking risks and opportunities. Whether you move to an establishment that's opening, like let's say somebody's opening a new bar or restaurant and you have the opportunity to move with them, you're going to need that emergency fund because initially it's going to be very slow for you to build out your customer base. It's going to be slow for you to build out your regulars and to get to see how you can create more opportunities within that. It's a learning curve. And so if you save that money, you're going to be able to say yes to a lot more opportunities that you're going to be able to build your income with.
Yeah, that's the power of having financial assets, right? It's the power of saving money. It's not deprivation. It's the polar opposite, right? Like it gives you power, it gives you strength. The epitome of FU money, right? Is, hey, if someone is putting me in an unsafe environment or asking something, to be able to say, I don't need this money. There's no world where I'm doing this. I mean, we talk about these pedestrian versions of, oh, my boss asked me to do something, or my pathetic thing of my boss asked me to, the workday started 30 minutes early. And that was just the straw that broke the camel's back for me. And it just seems so just arbitrary, and it just annoyed the hell out of me. But yeah, you're talking clearly real life situations that when you have that power and you're not beholden to, oh my goodness, my life could fall apart if I don't have this money. you can make very different decisions from a position of power.
You make totally different decisions. I can't tell you how many more situations I would have said no. I would have said, I'm sorry, I can't accommodate that request. I'm going to need to ask you to leave. I'm going to go get my manager, but I needed that money to make rent. I needed that money in order to, pay my car bill, whatever it was. But I'll tell you that you show up really differently and you really are able to stay in this career in a different way when you have that emergency fund. And I think it's really important to keep talking about that to people. And there's so many fun ways in this industry that you can save an emergency fund. Like I like to gamify everything and make it really fun. And so for people in the industry, I'm always like, let's make it fun to save your emergency fund. Like maybe if you're a waitress, you take 1 or 2 tables in your section and that's your emergency savings section. You will treat those people so much more differently. Or if you have a bar, like 2 or 3 stools, that's your emergency fund section. That's your EF section, right? Those people are going to keep you safe. And it's a fun way for you to be able to kind of segment it. Because I think when we think about employer provided benefits, we don't know how it's bucketed, but it's given to us. But when we're setting up benefits for ourselves, we need to understand that it's just about creating separation. This money is for this. This paid time off is for that. The average American gets 20 paid days off per year. That's a working month. When you think about an industry that doesn't have access to paid days off at all, then you start to understand why there's so much burnout, why there's so much turnover, why there's some of this bad PR that this industry has. So I often encourage people to set up their own PTO. Once we analyze those trends within their income, say, let's look at the holidays time, right? The month of November, December, you're going to make an extra $1,000. Let's take that $1,000. Let's put $100 into 10 different envelopes or whatever it looks like as far as a vessel. There, you have your next year's 10 paid days off for yourself, right? Because I think that's one thing that people don't understand is that even in states where you're like, oh, I live in a state where it's mandated, you have to have paid time off. Cash flow wise, that doesn't exist for you. First of all, we're talking about that $2.13. So let's say you have an 8-hour shift at $2.13. So you have $17. That's your paid day off. But then you have any amount of tip claiming, and that $17 is eaten away completely in taxes. So cash flow wise, you never see a paid day off. How many days are you going to show up sick? You're not going to go to the doctors. You're not going to go to the dentist. You're not going to take care of the things that you need to take care of because you're not actually getting a paid day off. And so this is another one of those systems where, it's a bucket that you have to set up for yourself because you have to advocate for yourself and you have to take days off.
Yeah, you think about like bizarre incentives, right? Like from an employer's standpoint, like they're basically incentivizing people to come in sick.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no other way to look at it than, it is in the employee's best interest, right, to come in sick, which is bizarre.
It's so strange.
Yeah, that just shouldn't be on any level. But the practical reality, just like everything we've been talking about for an hour, is these are the rules. Whether we agree with them, like them, this is the reality, not the rules, but this is the reality of the situation. And okay, you have to plan accordingly, plan for the best for yourself, and think long term. And Barbara, this has been amazing. I think it's just such a wonderful explanation of why this is so important, A, but B, practical steps people can take to make their lives better for the many million. I think, what did you say? Something on the order of 5 million people?
Yeah, there's over 5.5 million people working solely on a tip-based income in the US. And that's, that obviously excludes a fair amount of people who aren't reported.
Right. So this is critical. Thank you so much for being here. Obviously, we mentioned your book, Tipped, which can be found anywhere books are sold. Tipfinance.com, I know, is another one. Anywhere else you want to send people or you want to talk about?
People can find me on the socials. I'm on all of them at Tipped Finance. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. If you want to celebrate a win, I love to see service industry professionals setting some of this stuff up and winning. So please connect with me there.
Awesome. Barbara, thanks again. Really appreciate it. So good to see you.
Brad, this was a blast.